We will continue our thoughts this morning from the book of Psalm 19 on the words of my mouth. Probably the message that we have today should have been preached at the beginning of this, but if you had a more organized pastor than what you've got, this probably would have been done that way. But nonetheless, a true message is a true message, regardless. So when I write my book, I'll put this as the second chapter, rather than where we at. We're about 7 messages into this, but nonetheless, David says to us in the 19th Psalm, in the 14th verse, "Let the words of my mouth be acceptable. Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, my strength and my Redeemer." So David, psalmist, pens this. David has a son, Solomon, who writes in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, that because the preacher was wise, he taught the people knowledge and sought out acceptable words. No doubt you have the influence of not only a father to a son in the application of this text, but you have the influence of one generation to the next of the application of this text. So we'll entitle the message this morning, "The Acceptable Words of the Wise." The acceptable words of the wise. Now, just from this little verse, David says, "Let the words of my mouth be acceptable in thy sight." So the subject matter is already addressed. The subject matter is the words of my mouth. The character of that subject matter, or the characteristic at least of it, is that the words to be acceptable. The audience is also addressed in this. And I'd like for you to notice that this is an audience of one. To be acceptable in the sight of the Lord. Probably the easiest illustration I could give in understanding the point of this text is that when I sit across the table from another individual, instead of addressing that individual as who they are, I need to pretend like I'm addressing Jesus himself. Would I say what I'm fixing to say to Jesus if he was sitting across the table from me? Because the reality is he kind of really is. He sees and he knows and he hears everything I say, and what's worse, he knows everything I think. I think that's even worse. Which is what irritated the Pharisees so much. You know, when you read through the 4 Gospels, the one thing that irritated the Pharisees so much was Jesus would say to them, "Hey, why think ye in your hearts?" Or they're thinking in their heart something, and he'd just go ahead and answer their question. You know, this professional mind reader that was amongst people is still here today. Would I say to Jesus the very things that I'm fixing to say to this other person? Or should I have said those things that I just said? Now, Go ahead then, let's turn to Ecclesiastes 12. And let's read what Solomon has to say along these lines, because this will be, the remainder of the message will focus on the content of Ecclesiastes 12. I understand that the theme of Ecclesiastes, or at least from my perspective, is verse 8 of chapter 12. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. Isn't that a wonderful statement to live life by? That life is just vanity of vanities, all is vanity. Well, from one perspective, Solomon is correct about that. He's looking at everything down here on this earth. And he's already laid out for us in Ecclesiastes that he sought joy, he sought purpose, he sought fulfillment in everything under the sun. He sought it in wine, women, and music. He sought it in writing and reading. He tried to find purpose and meaning and fulfillment in earthly things, essentially. And what was his conclusion? Everything is vanity. This world will not satisfy you. And everything in this world that does bring any joy will one day leave you or be taken from you. At worst case, if the things around you aren't taken from you, chapter 12 says your ability to enjoy those things will be taken from you. If you live long enough, your ability to enjoy things in this life will be taken. So if you are seeking fulfillment in this world, you're going to be greatly discouraged. So on the conclusion of all of that, Solomon says, I have a job. Verse 9, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. He says there's got to be something beyond this. And of course, the theme of Ecclesiastes, the focus of Ecclesiastes, is constantly that phrase, under the sun. All is vanity, under the sun, under the sun, under the sun. When you come to the New Testament, what's one of the major themes of the New Testament? Is it things under the sun? No. Paul says, like in Colossians chapter 3, if you then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sitteth. Set your affection on things above, not on the earth. For your life is hid with Christ, or hid with God in Christ. Jesus says, when you see these things coming upon you, speaking of this generation, there's great and dreadful things coming. He says, when you see these things coming, look up, for your redemption draweth nigh. Part of the difficulty of us as human beings is maybe we don't spend enough time looking up. We spend a lot of time looking down, and maybe even a lot more time looking inward, and very little time looking upward. We look inward to say, well, I don't like this because this doesn't make me happy, this doesn't fulfill me, what's this going to do for me? If your marriage is based on what it's going to do for you, you're going to be disappointed. If raising children is based on what it'll do for you, you're going to be disappointed. If getting a job is just on the basis of what it'll do for you, you might still be disappointed. Jesus didn't do things based on what it would do for him. What he did was based on what it would do for you and me. The focus of New Testament is not to look inward, nor to look downward, but to look upward. Friends, we spend a lot of time looking out into the world. As the brother prayed this morning, there's a lot of chaos and problems in this world, are there not? This world looks like it is just absolutely bent and determined that it is going to destroy itself regardless of the outcome. What are we to do? He says, because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. See that word still? It didn't say he taught the people knowledge. It says he still taught the people knowledge. He was teaching the people knowledge. There is a recognition of everything in this life is vanity, nothing but vanities. There's nothing new under the sun. When Solomon says that there is nothing new under the sun in the book of Ecclesiastes, what he's saying is every problem that you and I are dealing with today is a problem that every generation before us has dealt with. There's nothing new under the sun. It's just simply human beings repeating the past mistakes of history. It is said that those who will not learn from the mistakes of history are doomed to repeat the mistakes of history. I think it should be said, a lot of people don't learn from the mistakes of history. It's not that they refuse to, they just don't learn. They look at it, they see it, and they just go on. Because the preacher was wise, he still taught the people knowledge. Yea, he gave good heed and sought out and set in order many proverbs. The preacher sought to find out acceptable words. And that which was written was upright, even words of truth. The words of the wise are as goads and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies, which are given from one shepherd. The preacher sought to find out acceptable words. So when the preacher speaks, he attempts to find words that are acceptable. Not only acceptable, but we might even go a little bit further and say appropriate words. There are some very sensitive subjects that the Bible addresses. And there may come times where there are very sensitive subjects that the preacher needs to address in a congregation. But the preacher needs to take note that there are older sheep and there are middle-aged sheep and there are very young lambs. And those subjects have to be dealt with in an acceptable and appropriate manner. So he says he sought out to find acceptable words. Now, the fact that we say that there's acceptable words, does that not then dictate that there are unacceptable words? There are decent versus indecent words. Clean versus vulgar. True versus lies. And there's sober words versus foolish words. There's all sorts out there. And it won't take you long to realize that in the world around us, a lot of people are more foolish than they are sober. because they're striving too hard in some of the religious orders around us to be relevant to the people. And I know what I'm talking about because I did that myself when I first got started. Maybe haven't rooted all of that out. And I never realized it's not me that's relevant. It's the preaching of the Word that's relevant. See, when David said in Psalm 19 that the law of the Lord is perfect, converting the soul, he didn't say the praise band is perfect, converting the soul. He didn't say the dance troupe is perfect, converting the soul. He didn't say the Sunday school is perfect, converting the soul. He didn't say the gimmicks of religious organization is perfect, converting the soul. He said the testimonies of the Lord are perfect, converting the soul. The testimonies of the Lord are wise, making sure the simple. It's the Word of God that's most relevant. That if you just read the Bible and teach the Bible for what it says, that's good enough. And if it takes a gimmick or a plan or a structure of man to, as they say, convert the soul, it's going to take the same gimmick to keep the soul converted. Now, we're not talking about regeneration, right? You're old Baptist, right? You understand the difference between regeneration and conversion, correct? Maybe. Yeah. Regeneration is God's work. Conversion is my work. Regeneration happens once. Conversion happens many times. The acceptable words that Solomon addresses here, the acceptable words then that we can note, as the writing says here in verse 10, that which was written was upright. So we have upright words. Even words of truth. So you have upright words. They're also called words of truth. The very next verse says the words of the wise. And of course, that in and of itself deserves a little bit of study because there are people who are wise in this world that we would not need to listen to. However, there is some concept wherein Jesus said that there are those who are wise in this world, or the children of this world are wiser in their generation than the children of light. What that means is a lot of times God's people go through life a little sort of naive. They go through life with blinders on. They want to see the good in everybody. And so times they foolishly walk into dangerous situations, assuming other people are just as kind as they are. And that is not the case. Follow me on that? 1:30 in the morning, if you're a young lady, probably ought not to be out by yourself walking out of a bar at 1:30 in the morning. You get my point? Because what does parents say? What did your mom and daddy teach you? Nothing good happens after dark, and especially after midnight. Oh, well, that's not fair. I should have the right to walk about freely. And I agree with you. You should have the right to walk about freely. You should have the right to do anything you want to, free of harm. Yes. If you weren't living in this sin-cursed earth, you could. But you have to recognize that when the sun goes down and the darkness comes around, so do the bats and the lizards and the snakes and the creepy crawly things. Not only in this world, but in the hearts of unregenerate human beings. Acceptable words. And then he says here, all of this. So you might be asking yourself, why all of this fuss over the last few weeks over the words of my mouth? Can't I just tell it like it is? Well, you can. As a human being, you have that right to just stand up. You have the freedom of speech here in America to just tell it like it is. What are you trying to accomplish? What are you trying to accomplish with your words? Are you thinking about this? Because he says, the words of the wise are as goads and as nails fastened by the masters of assemblies. Now, when you look at masters of assemblies, are we talking about an individual who is in charge of an assembly of people? Possibly. But are you talking about also a man who is in charge of assemblies, as in the word assembly is building something? I think it's both. I really think it's both. But let's back up just a little bit on this. Ecclesiastes 9. 9 and verse 17. The words of wise men are heard in quiet more than the cry of him that ruleth among fools. Why do I not watch the news anymore? Because the words of wise men are heard in quiet more than they are among fools. Because the people on TV think they're right because they yell the loudest. And the moment somebody across the table from them says something that either they disagree with or they say something that is absolutely foolish. I have heard some of the most foolish things come out of the mouth of talking heads in the last 4 or 5 years. And I'm thinking, you cannot be this dumb. You're intentionally being this way. Whatever the case, the moment one person starts talking and another person hears them say something they disagree with, what happens? Everybody starts talking. And it sounds like a barnyard of chickens. And I've gotten to the point in my age where I cannot decipher a lot of heavy talk. If there's two of y'all talking to me at the same time, I'm not listening to either one of you because I can't hear you. One of the funniest things I ever heard, we had delivered some furniture to a customer of ours and went to knock on the door and say we're done, but he was on the phone with a young lady that he was trying to, some billing problem was up there, and you could hear him, because every time he'd try and talk, she'd interrupt him, and he said, look, we can sing together, but we can't talk together. I'm like, hey, that's all right. That's not bad right there. The words of the wise are heard in quiet, not in loud clamoring. True authority is not about volume or force, but about wisdom and understanding. We're to seek to influence others through godly wisdom rather than relying on positional power or loudness. I don't know about y'all, but this has been a problem with me over the years. You know, the Bible outlines this on a number of occasions. But specifically speaking, we have seen David write acceptable words. His son Solomon picked up that same torch and wrote acceptable words. What happened in 1 Kings 12 with Solomon's son Jeroboam? Did Solomon's son Jeroboam pick up the same torch of acceptable words? Oh, he picked up a torch, all right. What did he do with it? 1 Kings chapter 12 and verse 13. The people came to Jeroboam and they said, you know, hey, your daddy was okay with us, but all the things that we did for him were a little taxing. Hey, could you kind of let up on us a little bit? And some wise old men said to Jeroboam, you need to listen to these people and do what they say. And the younger generation said to Jeroboam, they're all foolish. Don't listen to the wise old men. They don't know what they're talking about. So in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 13, the king answered the people roughly and forsook the old men's counsel that they gave him and spake to them after the counsel of the young men, saying, my father made your yoke heavy. I will add to your yoke. My father also chastised you with whips, but I will chastise you with scorpions. And what happened? He burned the kingdom down. You have the right to say to your husband or your spouse, or to your preacher, or to the deacons, or to your boss, or to your employees, you have the right to say anything you want to. Be careful that your foolish mouth does not burn down your house. The words of the wise are to be acceptable words, and they're to be words acceptable in the sight of the Lord. I mean, because look at it. Look at what's going on. Look at our nation destroying itself right now. This side over here is right. Because look at all the people on this side. And look how loud these people are. They're right. And look at all the people on the other side. They're right. Because look at all the people on their side. And listen how loud they are. They're all right. They're all right with each other. You following what's happening here? Words acceptable to men, not necessarily acceptable to the Lord. In Proverbs chapter 12, this is a phrase that most of us have heard all our life. It appears a number of times in the Bible. But Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 15 says, the way of a fool is right in his own eyes. He's not worried about pleasing anybody but himself. The way of a fool is right in his own eyes, but he that hearkeneth unto counsel is wise. I realize the most annoying phrase that anybody can say to you when you're involved in any situation, I realize the most annoying phrase is, well, if I was you, I'd do this. No. If you were me, you would do what I did because I am me and I did what I did. What you ought to say to this person is, well, if you were me, I'd do it another way. To which that person would reply, I don't even like you. Why would I do it like you? No. The comparison of you versus me and how I know more than you is really foolish. In other words, I can't solve all the problems, let's say just of my children. If I get involved in their life and solve all their problems for them, what happens when I die? Who then will get in their life and solve their problems? You following me? See, this is why families often dissolve after mother or father has died, because possibly mother or father has spent too much time being a busybody and fixing other people's problems and have not told them that the true answer to your problems is God Almighty. Because when I'm dead and gone, you're going to be left here holding what? An empty bag of I don't know what to do because my daddy always did it. Or an empty bag of I don't know what to do because my mama always did it. Some of you are married to men whose mama always did it, right? Boy. That's true though. Some of y'all are. And you thought that when he said I do, he was going to magically change and be Mr. Superman. And now you're ticked off having to do everything for him his mama used to do, right? Why won't he change? He ain't never had to change. And now you're going to spend the rest of your marriage trying to change him or her. How's that going to work for you? I guarantee you at some point in your life you're going to have to come up with some acceptable words to say to this person. When Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, he said to them twice in 1 Corinthians, both in 1 Corinthians 1 and in 1 Corinthians chapter 2. For example, he says in 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 17, that Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Now, we've covered this a time or two in the past. I wouldn't mind baptizing somebody today. If somebody come up after church and said, I'd like to be baptized, I'd like to confess my faith in Christ to be baptized, follow him in baptism, we'd be glad to baptize you. Baptize you this Sunday, baptize you next Sunday. You say, well, the baptistry's not full. No, but I bet the creek outside is full this morning. We'll take you out there. We can do that. We're anything but we can adjust. That's right. Absolutely. However, Paul says, baptism's not my goal. I'd like to baptize more people. But just getting somebody to join is not my goal. Paul said, my goal is to preach the gospel. Not with wisdom of words. Notice what he says there. Not with wisdom of words, it's 1 Corinthians 1:17, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect. He also says it sort of like this in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 13. He says in chapter 2, verse 13, which things also we speak, not in the words which man's wisdom teacheth, but which the Holy Ghost teacheth. There's probably times where I could polish up my English language a little bit better. It was said of Will Rogers that he has said, I'd rather hear a man say, I seen something, who had actually seen something, than hear a man say, I saw something, who hadn't seen anything at all. Now, when I looked that up on Google, that's not attributed to Will Rogers. I don't know where it came from. So I'll just say to you, I'd rather hear a man say, I seen something, who's actually seen something, than hear a man say, I saw it, who hadn't seen anything at all. I have heard preachers in the past say that one of the greatest detriments to the church can be education. And here's what I mean by that. And here's what the older minister meant by that. He gave a reference. He did not give the man's name because he didn't want to insult his family. He said, but this man, though he did not have a great earthly education, was one of the wisest Bible teachers he'd ever met in his life. But his children grew up and went off to university, got educated by the men of this world, and when they came back, they could no longer stand Daddy's preaching anymore because Daddy was too much of an empty-headed redneck. And they couldn't get past the fact he didn't use big 15-cylinder words, and he didn't use flowery language, and he didn't stand up here and polish his vocabulary. He just talked like a good old country redneck. Well, if you want me to give you a good oration, I can give you that. I'd rather just stand up here and tell the truth. And maybe I say I be done seen something, and that ain't the right thing to say. But if I've seen it, I've seen it. See what I mean? Paul talks about those when he talked to young minister Timothy. If you didn't catch that, just rewind the tape and listen. Maybe I didn't even catch it. But you know, Paul even told Timothy in 2 Timothy 4, 2 Timothy 4, he told him that the time would come when they will not endure sound doctrine. 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 3. The time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but after their own lust shall they heap to themselves teachers, having itching ears, and they shall turn away their ears from the truth, and shall be turned unto fables. They will be turned unto fables because the fables sound a whole lot better to them than the truth. But I assure you, there's a lot of people who fill our churches who cling a little bit more to fables than they do truth anyways. So, for example, $100. Are y'all listening? I'll give $100 to the first person who gives me book, chapter, and verse where it says, hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Anyone? I'll go ahead and give you a note. That's not King James Bible. That's Shakespeare. $100 to the person that says, that can give me the book, chapter, and verse of cleanliness is next to godliness. Anyone? $100 to those who can find me the book, chapter, and verse that says God helps those who help themselves. $100 to the person that can find the book, chapter, and verse that tells me every stool must stand on its own leg and every bucket must sit on its own bottom. You think, that's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Good for you. I'm glad. But you know, there are a lot of people that oh, by the way, that's Pilgrim's Progress, not King James Bible. Every bucket must sit on its own bottom, which means, essentially it means every person must be self-sufficient. You can't be relying on everybody else around you, but that's beside the point. There's a lot of people that believe things that aren't in the Bible because they sound a whole lot better to them than the things of the Bible do. God doesn't help those who help themselves. God helps those who are helpless, is what the Scripture says. The acceptable words of the wise, then, that Solomon talks about in Ecclesiastes 12 are goads and nails, and the nails are fastened by masters of assemblies. You all know what a goad is, right? Maybe. Farmers have these sticks, and on the end of the stick is about like a nail. You use it to poke things. You know what a nail is, right? Hammer it into a wall, hold something in place. We've all seen people who don't know how to hammer a nail properly, right? We've all seen people hammer crooked nails. So this master of assembly essentially is an individual who knows how to use appropriate words in an acceptable manner. So in other words, you can drive people, but you can drive them in the wrong direction. And you can hammer a nail, but you can hammer it crooked, and you can hammer it in a wrong direction. I was watching a guy on YouTube the other day. He was showing how to toenail frame a wall or some rafter on a house. He made the comment, we tried to think of how many nails that we use on an average house. And he says, I think I come up with a number of like 70,000. Well, that's a lot of hammering. Now, folks nowadays that use these air guns, that's impressive. You can still do something wrong with a nail gun. You can send yourself to the hospital in a hurry with a nail gun. But there's a guy from the 70s or 80s. What's that guy's name? His last name's Haun. Haun. I think that's the way it is. You talk about a master builder. This man's got a roofing hammer. It's about 18 inches. How long's the longest roofing hammer? It's about 8. When he hung it on his hip, it went from his hip down to his knee. But that's right, though. These little dinky Home Depot Ace Hardware hammers that we use, they're not good for this. You need something about 18 inches, 20 inches long. Get a good swing. This man's got these 16 penny nails. 2 taps. One to tap it in, one to hammer it home. That's it. Whoa! That's a master. That's a man that knows exactly what to do with the tools God has given him. In Proverbs chapter 1, Solomon writes this to his young son. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 5. A wise man will hear and will increase learning, and a man of understanding shall attain unto wise counsels. To understand a proverb and the interpretation, the words of the wise and their dark sayings. See, it's not that we're just trying to collect words. It's not that we're trying to show people that we have memorized a dictionary. It's to gather understanding. Dark sayings are essentially like proverbs or riddles. And we're trying to figure out just exactly what it means. Paul was a very intelligent person. There's no doubt about that. And sometimes even in a human being's best effort, he doesn't use the plainest of language. Sometimes it's his fault. Maybe sometimes it's our fault. Maybe sometimes it's the fault of the subject you're dealing with. Peter, in 2 Peter, though, has this to say about the Apostle Paul. In 2 Peter chapter 3, he says in verse 15, "Account that the long suffering of our Lord is salvation, even as our beloved brother Paul, also according to the wisdom given unto him, hath written unto you." Now, I'd like for you to notice there, he says that's wisdom given unto him. Mm-hmm. So this is special wisdom here. Wisdom from above. But notice what he says about this. Verse 16, "As also in all his epistles, speaking in them of these things." A lot of things Peter has just addressed in this chapter. He says Paul has also talked about this in his wisdom. But here's what he says about Paul's wisdom and in his epistles. "In which are some things hard to be understood." Ain't no doubt about that. That is an understatement about the writings of Paul. One of the most mysterious characters in all the Bible is the character Melchizedek. When you go back and you read about this individual, he is one of the most fascinating and most mysterious characters in all the Old Testament. You know what Paul said to the Hebrews about this? He says, "There's a lot of things I'd like to write to you about Melchizedek, but you are dull of hearing." What? Paul, who cares about them? Just write it. We'll sort it out. And he just leaves it. But notice what Peter says about this. He says, "In which some things are to be hard to be understood, which they that are unlearned and unstable wrest, as they do also the other scriptures under their own destruction." And notice the word rest there is a W-R-E-S-T. Not a R-E-S-T where you lay down and go to sleep, but a W-R-E-S-T, rest like a wrestle, like a wrestler, a twisting and a turning. In other words, when there's a subject that needs great understanding and studying, an individual who is ignorant and unlearned, when they get a hold of that subject and they don't know what to do with it, they will often twist it to their own destruction. So in other words, when an 18 or 19-year-old child leaves home and they go off out into the world, they think all the things that Mama and Daddy did were ignorant, archaic, backwards, and dumb. And they're going to get out here in the world and they're going to take the world by the bull horns and they're going to solve the world's problems. How long do you think it's going to take them to realize Mom and Daddy weren't as ignorant as they thought they were? One of the reasons that we keep having to deal with socialism and communism and all other kind of isms in this world is that the majority of people who are screaming about this have no idea what they're talking about. Because number one, you can't have a bunch of Americans who've lived in freedom all their life tell you about socialism. They don't know what they're talking about. Maybe you ought to listen to somebody who escaped from it. Heard a lady say the other day, and this is going to shock you. You remember Sherry Lewis, Lamb Chop? You remember her? Her sweet little daughter now has taken up her mama's craft, sounds just like her, and used the statement the other day, "I have escaped from America." You idiot. Nobody escapes from America. You have the freedom to leave. And if you have the freedom to leave, you're not escaping. You're just on vacation somewhere else. People escape from North Korea. And they escape from Cuba. And they escape from these other places. But to get Americans to understand that, who've lived in freedom all their life, sometimes is a hard row to hoe. Solomon says in Ecclesiastes chapter 10 that the words, Ecclesiastes chapter 10 and verse 12, the words of a wise man's mouth are gracious, but the lips of a fool will swallow up himself. Let me move now to the last portion of this text, because the Bible describes for us the benefits of these acceptable words, that they are indeed goads and nails in the hand of masters of assemblies. The goads that are used to motivate and to move an individual describe what we're trying to do with our words. I mean, if somebody's doing something wrong, somebody's doing something you disagree with. Notice what I did there? There's some things that sometimes we bring on young people at work because the job's a little overwhelming, so we bring some few young people on. And a lot of these young people, they're ready to go, and they're just going to get in there and tear it all up, and they're just going to get started. All right, we're going to get started doing what? Whatever. Let me just I'll pull something, push something, throw something, it doesn't matter. You can't put something in place A if there's something already in place A, right? It's like two cars on the road cannot occupy the same spot. But sometimes people don't understand that. We'll just pack it all in the warehouse and then we'll sort it out later. Okay, so we're just going to move it all into the warehouse and then figure out what we need is actually in the back of the warehouse, but we can't get to the back of the warehouse because all the things in the front of the warehouse. So now we got to pull out everything in the front of the warehouse to get to what's in the back of the warehouse. That if we just pulled out what's in the back first, we could have put what's in the front in the back. Y'all got that? So they're doing something I disagree with. But it's not necessarily wrong. It's different. It's not the way I would do it. Boy, this is frustrating right now. I am just absolutely about to come out of my skin right now thinking about this. But it's my job to motivate them. Now, I realize that there are just some people who cannot be motivated. It does not matter what you say to them. You could put them on a powder keg and light it on fire, and it still would not motivate them to move. It would blow up. And when the dust settles, they'd still be sitting there on nothing. I can tell you this, that for the rest of my life, everything that I have to say to you or anybody else will not come from a wise man who has learned so much. It will come from a man who has made so many mistakes. I at least know what not to do. Paul says in Ephesians 6, and he also accompanies this in Colossians chapter 3, both places. He doesn't use the word goad, but he does use the word provoke. And he says in Ephesians 6, and he says in Colossians 3, fathers, provoke not your children to wrath. Fathers, provoke not your children to anger, lest they be discouraged. When you look at the word provoked, past tense, in the Old Testament, almost every single case that I think I found has reference to Israel provoking God to anger, wrath, and jealousy through their actions, through their idolatry. And in Psalm 106:43, it says that they provoked the Lord to wrath through their counsel. There's a lot of people in America being provoked on both sides of the aisle. And a lot of them are not being provoked to the right thing. And we as a church need to pay attention to that. Politics is not our thing. Now, the Bible does get political. But our king doesn't sit in Washington. Our king sits in heaven. Our king sits in glory. And the laws that govern our life don't necessarily come from Washington or Montgomery. They come from a court a lot higher than this Supreme Court. What we are to goad people into doing is told to us in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 24. Hebrews 10 verse 24, he says, "Let us consider one another to provoke unto love and good works." When you talk to your spouse, you talk to your husband, you talk to your wife, you talk to your children, when you talk to your parents, why don't you attempt to provoke them to love instead of daring them to defy you? I grew up with the mindset that if you don't like your parents' rules, you can get out and make your own rules. Who grew up with that? Stop it. Other than my family, who grew up with that? Whose parents told them, you don't like it, you can get out and leave? You ever said that to your wife? No, the church, we're against divorce. Even if she's stubborn and stupid? Even if he's hateful and abusive? We're against it. You don't like the rules, get out and leave. We'd never say it to our spouse, but we'd say it to our children. Why? Because we're not thinking about the words coming out of our mouth. Their nails used to fasten, used to establish. And that's why Paul says when you provoke them unto wrath or you provoke them unto anger, they become discouraged. And a lot of people, they get fixated right there. And they stay discouraged the entirety of their life. And there's a lot of people who spend the rest of their life apologizing for everything. It doesn't matter what they do. They apologize constantly. You ever met somebody like that? You know why they apologize constantly? Because they were made to apologize all their life. Didn't matter what they did. Didn't matter if they were in school. Didn't matter if they were in home. Didn't matter if they were in the church. We've had some ridiculous stuff. You realize, it's just occurred to me in the last few years, in our church minutes, we have church conference. Y'all have all had church conference. There's a there's a line item in there called acknowledgments. Y'all know about that? How many of you thought that the acknowledgments meant somebody's supposed to stand up and confess a sin that they had done? That's not what that means. It means you're supposed to stand up and say, I'm sorry for missing last conference. Who cares if you missed last conference? You missed church. We don't care about that. We care that you missed this man-made organization that we made an idol here in God's house. Ridiculous. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 58, my brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. See, Solomon talked about things that were under the sun and how everything was vanity and upside down and vain. Paul goes the opposite direction. He says, your work is not down here under the sun. You're not working for an employer. You're working for the Lord. Let's nail this down. Be steadfast, unmovable in the work of the Lord. For as much as you know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Not talking about labor on this earth. Not labor for another man. Your labor for the Lord is not in vain. Acceptable words go a long way to accomplishing a successful end. They go a long way to accomplishing a godly end. So David says, let the words of my mouth be acceptable in thy sight. Solomon says, I sought out acceptable words. Words that acceptably provoked and motivated people in the right direction and established to them in the right principles and in the right position in life in front of God. Thank you for your good and patient attention.